Welcome to session number 9 in the Anglican Tradition series. I've mentioned earlier in this series the importance of the patristic period of time, which stretched from about the 3rd to the 7th century within Christian history. Now, there's various ways in which we can approach the patristic period. There are those what we call, on the one hand, which buy into the Constantinian fall thesis. And though, if you particularly take this position, then why would you even be concerned with the 2nd to the 7th century of the Christian era? So people then move on to the deterioration of Christianity from pretty well the 2nd, the 3rd century up to the Reformation. And then Reformation, as it were, up from the grave he arose again, and you get back to the importance of the Bible and the Bible for Protestants in their particular understanding of the faith perspective. The other side, within the Christian tradition, is to say, in fact, from the 2nd to the 7th century, you have the golden era of Christianity. And so how do we make sense of these two different perspectives? One arguing a great decline of Christianity from the 2nd to the 3rd century up to the 16th. The other arguing that the high point of Christianity is from the 2nd to the 6th century, and by the time you get Protestantism, you're beginning to get the decline of Christianity. Much, of course, hinges on a person's perspective in terms of the Bible, the faith journey, the view of the church, and public life itself. Now, the Anglican tradition, in terms of when it comes to the Fathers, unlike, say, the Orthodox, it's quite willing to raise a series of critical questions of the Fathers, because the Fathers themselves did not agree on everything, either in the East or the West. And so rather than just uncritically approaching the Fathers, we try to get inside of what we call the mind or the spirit of the Fathers. And so the task is to, on the one hand, walk the middle way. And again, this is an Anglican, a very distinct and time-honored Anglican way, is arguing there is a middle way between idealizing the Fathers and, on the other hand, demonizing the Fathers. And it's in this you have a critical read of the Fathers in terms of seeing what can be learned from sitting with the mothers and fathers of the church and its relevance for us today. And so it is in this critical read and trying to get inside the spirit and the mind of the Fathers without either idealizing or demonizing that, in fact, their voice, their presence, their influence, their perspective can have an impact in the ongoing life of the church today. And this is when we talk about the communion of the saints and the men and the women of the historic church and what they have to offer us. Let me just touch on a few elements of the patristic era that can play a significant role for us today. First, the area of biblical exegesis or interpretation. Within the classical tradition of Christianity, there were a variety of ways of interpreting the text. One was the literal, the grammatical, the historic, in which they tried to take, obviously, the text seriously at that level. So, for example, when the Jews left Egypt, crossed the desert, and went the Promised Land, that is seen as a part of a historic journey of the Jews as they were freed from Pharaonic dominance, and God was leading them into the Promised Land. That can be read in a literal, historical way. It can also be read in a mystical or allegorical way, in which the departure from Egypt is where you're leaving the Egypt of your false self. And then a person has to cross the desert of who they are not into the promised land of their new being in Christ. And that's an allegorical way of reading the text rather than purely a literal grammatical. The story of Jonah, for example, should that just be read as a literal fish that Jonah went into, was thrown up? And if so, for those who are concerned with the literal, grammatical, scientific, they try and find, could a fish do this sort of thing? And what would a person be like if they were thrown up? The allegorical reading of it is that each and all on their journey have to go into the darkness, die to their darkness, and then they resurrect phoenix-like and are thrown up into their new being. And so an allegorical or a literal reading of the text. The mothers and the fathers were not against the literal, but they also said it was the allegorical was very important in terms of the transformation of the soul. The mothers and fathers of the church had a high view of the unity of the church, so there was no east or west, because they took seriously the call to unity you find in the Bible and the creeds. Also, the public witness of the fathers and mothers of the church. They were at the forefront in the large economic, military, public issues of the day, as as makers of peace, as callers for justice, and very concerned with the ecological questions of their time. And so particular areas of interpretation, unity of the church, and light, salt, and yeast in the world was the triple chord of the mothers and fathers of the patristic era.